What if the greatest threat to your financial future was not a recession, not inflation, not a market crash, but a hidden machine built centuries ago that still shapes every dollar you earn, save, or lose today? What if the rise and fall of your wealth were never random, but part of a quiet design engineered by people you have never voted for and will never meet? This is the uncomfortable question that sits at the center of every major financial crisis, every currency collapse, every sudden shift in the global economy. And once you see how this machine works, you cannot unsee it. Because the truth is that the modern economy did not emerge naturally. It was constructed piece by powerful dynasties, bankers, and political architects who understood something long before the rest of the world did. They knew that real power does not come from armies or territory. It comes from controlling the flow of money itself. They learned how to manipulate debt, influence governments, and reshape financial systems so subtly that entire nations became dependent on mechanisms they did not understand. And while empires fell, borders changed, and societies rose and crumbled, the machine only became stronger. You can trace its origins through the rise of early merchant bankers, the creation of central banks, the birth of bond markets, and the quiet consolidation of monetary influence. Each stage added a new layer. Each crisis expanded its reach. Each war, each collapse, each reconstruction gave the machine another opportunity to grow. Economists call it structural power. Historians call it financial hegemony. But for ordinary people, it feels like something else entirely. It feels like invisible hands deciding the price of your food, the value of your savings, the interest on your debt, and the limits of your prosperity. And here is the part most people never consider. The machine works precisely because it stays hidden. It relies on complexity, on silence, on the belief that the system is too big to understand. But the more you uncover, the more the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. And as we peel back these layers, you may start noticing how many moments in your own life were quietly shaped by forces far beyond your control. If this is already making you question the world you live in, tell me in the comments what part of this resonates with you. Leave a like so this content reaches more people. And check if you are already subscribed, because what you will see next might change the way you understand money forever, as we continue unfolding this story and move deeper into the hidden structure behind your wealth. The moment you begin tracing this hidden structure back to its origins, the story becomes even more unsettling. Because long before modern banks, long before global markets, long before national currencies existed as we know them, the foundations of this economic machine were already being built quietly in the background. It began, not with governments, but with merchants who understood that controlling trade routes meant controlling wealth. They learned that influence flowed not from owning resources, but from controlling the mechanisms that moved those resources. And from this early insight emerged the first blueprint of financial power. As empires expanded and international commerce grew, these merchant networks evolved into sophisticated financial families, who operated across borders in ways that kings and governments could not. They were not bound by land. They were not limited by political cycles. Their loyalty was to capital, to information, to the leverage that came from being the only ones who understood how money truly moved. While most societies were still operating on simple exchange systems, these early financial architects were already experimenting with credit instruments, bills of exchange, and forms of debt that allowed them to operate on a scale unimaginable to ordinary citizens. This was the period when information itself became a form of currency. The first powerful financial dynasties understood that whoever received news first could lend before others reacted, invest before others noticed, and profit before others realized what happened. And because governments relied on them for loans, these early financiers gained leverage that transcended national boundaries. They could influence wars by choosing who to fund. They could shape trade by choosing which merchants received credit. They could decide which rulers rose and which ones fell simply by controlling the flow of liquidity. What most people never see is that this stage of history created the fundamental architecture that still governs global finance today. The separation between those who use money and those who create the conditions in which money operates did not appear recently. It was engineered centuries ago and refined through each era of expansion. Step by step, These financial networks created a system where wealth moved upward quietly, predictably, almost mechanically. And the system grew stronger with every crisis, because each collapse made societies even more dependent on those who understood how to rebuild what had fallen. As this influence expanded, the seeds of the global economic machine began taking shape, preparing the way for the next evolution of power that would transform not only nations, but the entire financial fabric of the modern world. As these early networks expanded, something far more powerful began to form behind the scenes. Dynasties that were no longer just merchants or lenders, but silent architects of entire monetary systems. They discovered that true influence was not achieved by simply financing trade or lending to rulers, but by shaping the very rules that governed economic activity. They realized that if they could determine how money was valued, how debts were structured, how credit flowed, they would no longer be participants in the system. They would be its designers. This is when the transformation from wealthy families to global financial dynasties truly began. These groups understood that governments were unpredictable, rulers came and went, and political alliances shifted constantly. But debt was permanent. Currency was permanent. Demand for capital never disappeared. So instead of aligning themselves with nations, they aligned themselves with financial principles that could survive any political change. They built infrastructures of trust, information networks, and cross-border alliances that allowed them to operate above the volatility of governments. Step by step, their power grew. They started by funding monarchies desperate for revenue, then expanded into financing wars, industrial expansion, and infrastructure projects. Each loan was not merely a transaction, it was leverage. A government indebted to them could be influenced, pressured, or guided. Nations unable to repay were forced into renegotiations that strengthened these financial families even more. Their influence no longer came from armies or titles, but from the quiet power of obligation. Over time, they mastered the art of currency manipulation. They learned how to profit from fluctuations, how to stabilize markets when it benefited them, and how to let instability spread when chaos created opportunity. They introduced the concept that money itself could be leveraged, traded, expanded, and contracted in ways ordinary citizens could not comprehend. And because they operated across nations, they could exploit differences in currency value, interest rates, and economic cycles to their advantage. By the time most governments realized what was happening, these dynasties had already become indispensable. Their capital was needed for reconstruction after wars. Their networks were essential for trade expansion. Their expertise was sought in moments of crisis. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, they evolved into something even more powerful, the core mechanism through which nations accessed credit and stabilized their economies. What had begun as scattered merchant families had now become financial pillars capable of influencing the fate of continents. And as their power expanded, the next phase of the global machine was set into motion, preparing to spread through crises that would reshape the economic world in ways no one could anticipate. As these dynasties embedded themselves deeper into the financial bloodstream of nations, the next stage of the machine emerged during periods of crisis. Wars, depressions, and political collapses did not weaken their influence, they amplified it. Every disruption created an opening, a gap in which governments became desperate for stability, liquidity, and direction. And in these moments of vulnerability, the financial families that had spent decades mastering debt and currency were the only ones capable of supplying what nations urgently needed. Crises became catalysts, accelerating the expansion of their power. When economies collapsed, these groups provided emergency funds at terms that ensured long-term dependence. When wars drained treasuries, they financed both reconstruction and the next phase of industrial growth. When currencies destabilized, they offered solutions grounded not in national interest, but in financial architecture that benefited the system they had already built. They became the quiet arbiters of recovery, shaping the structure of post-crisis economies while the public focused on political leaders who were often just executing strategies designed elsewhere. And because crises forced governments to make decisions quickly, the financial dynasties gained unprecedented access. They influenced regulation, advised on monetary reforms, and moved into positions that allowed them to coordinate policy across nations. Over time, they were no longer simply responding to crises. They were positioned to anticipate them, prepare for them, and, in certain cases, benefit from their aftermath. The machine evolved with every shock, becoming more adaptive, more integrated, more essential. What made this transformation so effective was the public's inability to connect the dots. People saw wars, recessions, recoveries, and political transitions, but they did not see the continuity behind them. They did not recognize that the same financial networks were present in every rebuilding phase, strengthening their grip with each new cycle. This invisibility was their greatest asset. It allowed the machine to expand without resistance, embedding itself deeper into the economic foundations of the world. And as this influence accumulated, the line between national policy and private financial interest became harder to distinguish. Decisions that shaped the lives of millions were increasingly tied to the logic of a system built long before those citizens were born. The global economic machine was no longer emerging. It was establishing itself as the silent authority behind every major shift in prosperity and power, a force that would continue evolving as the world faced new cycles of instability. As you think about how crises have shaped your own lifetime, share in the comments what patterns you have noticed and how they connect to this hidden architecture that keeps expanding beneath the surface. As the influence of these financial dynasties deepened during each crisis, the next phase of the machine took shape. The creation of instruments that would formalize their power and extend it far beyond the reach of any single government. They understood that to turn temporary leverage into permanent authority, they needed structures that could standardize debt, regulate currency, and manage economic flows in a predictable, scalable way. This was the moment when the foundations of modern finance emerged, not as innovations of public institutions, but as strategic tools designed to expand control. The first major transformation came with the evolution of government bonds. What had once been simple loans became sophisticated instruments capable of influencing entire national budgets. Governments relied on these dynasties not only to purchase bonds, but to market them, rate them, and distribute them globally. Whoever shaped the bond market shaped the cost of borrowing for nations, determining which countries could grow and which ones would face perpetual financial strain. The machine began to operate on a planetary scale, connecting distant economies through webs of obligation. Soon after, the development of early stock exchanges offered an entirely new frontier. Shares of companies, infrastructure projects, and trading ventures could now be bought and sold with unprecedented fluidity. But these markets were not created to empower ordinary citizens. They were designed to centralize capital, converting influence into a measurable asset that these financial families could accumulate and deploy strategically. The same networks that financed governments now financed entire industries, determining which sectors thrived and which ones withered. As industrialization accelerated, new financial products emerged: credit facilities, underwriting arrangements, clearinghouses, and international currency settlements. Each innovation increased efficiency on the surface, but beneath that efficiency was a deeper purpose. These instruments allowed the machine to operate with precision, transforming debt into a perpetual resource and money into a tool of coordination across continents. Nations saw these mechanisms as progress. The dynasties saw them as infrastructure, a network that ensured their influence could outlast political regimes, economic cycles, and generational change. All of this culminated in the rise of institutions that appeared neutral, technical, and administrative, but were ultimately shaped by the same financial logic. They standardized risk, dictated monetary policy, and integrated markets in ways that made withdrawal impossible. Gradually, the world shifted from economies driven by production to economies driven by finance, where value was defined by flows of capital controlled by the machine itself. And as these tools gained global acceptance, the next stage of transformation was already quietly forming, setting the stage for a level of control far beyond anything that had existed before. As these instruments of modern finance spread across continents, a new structure began to rise, a structure far more powerful and far more enduring than any individual dynasty. What emerged was a coordinated network of institutions that operated above governments, beyond elections, and outside the reach of ordinary citizens. These were not monarchs, not corporations, not political movements. They were the architects of policy itself, shaping the financial realities that entire nations would inherit. And once these institutions took form, the machine no longer depended on families or individual financiers. It became a system with its own momentum. The creation of central banks marked the turning point. What began as mechanisms to stabilize currencies quickly transformed into engines of monetary authority. With the ability to expand or contract money supply, set interest rates, and determine liquidity, central banks became the quiet governors of national economies. Their decisions influenced everything from employment levels to the cost of living, yet their inner workings remained inaccessible to the public. They operated with the language of neutrality, but every policy reflected the same underlying architecture that had been shaped by centuries of financial consolidation. Alongside them emerged international institutions built during periods of reconstruction and global tension. These organizations presented themselves as guardians of stability, offering guidance and assistance during crises. But their influence extended far deeper. They established economic standards that countries were expected to follow, enforced reforms that aligned with global financial interests, and shaped the policies of developing nations in ways that mirrored the priorities of the machine. What looked like cooperation was, in practice, integration. Nations adopted frameworks designed not for local prosperity, but for systemic consistency. And as financial markets became more interconnected, private networks grew just as influential. Investment houses, rating agencies, clearing systems, and global banks formed the operational backbone of the machine. Their decisions determined the flow of capital across borders, the valuation of currencies, and the viability of entire industries. They provided analysis that governments relied on, liquidity that markets depended on, and strategies that shaped global investment trends. Yet they answered to no electorate and faced no direct accountability. Over time, these public and private structures fused into a single ecosystem, a complex, interdependent network capable of influencing global outcomes without ever appearing to act. Governments began to adjust policies not based on national preference, but on the expectations of markets. Political leaders changed, but the underlying rules did not. The machine had evolved beyond the families that built it, beyond the crises that expanded it, and beyond the borders that once limited it. It now functioned as a self-reinforcing system, shaping the trajectory of nations while remaining almost invisible to the people living within it. As this ecosystem matured, its influence reached a level that even the earliest financial dynasties could never have imagined. It no longer shaped only currencies, interest rates, or flows of capital. It shaped national priorities, political decisions, and the long-term direction of societies. Policies that appeared to be ideological choices were often responses to signals coming from this system. Markets pushed, governments adapted, and over time, the machine became the silent partner in every major decision that affected the financial lives of billions. What made this evolution so profound was the subtlety of its operation. Power was no longer exerted through visible commands or explicit demands. It manifested through expectations embedded in financial models, risk assessments, credit ratings, and economic forecasts. A country that resisted these signals would face capital flight, rising borrowing costs, or currency pressure. A country that aligned with them gained stability, investment, and approval. The machine did not need to force compliance, it incentivized it. And nations learned quickly that survival depended on moving with the current rather than against it. This influence seeped into domestic politics as well. Policymakers crafted budgets around what markets considered acceptable. Social programs expanded or contracted based not on public need, but on fiscal frameworks endorsed by institutions whose priorities aligned with global financial standards. Even foreign policy was shaped by the flow of capital. Alliances strengthened or weakened according to trade interests, investment opportunities, and the economic dependencies that tied nations together. The machine had become a map of invisible boundaries, guiding countries toward choices that benefited systemic stability over individual autonomy. For ordinary citizens, these shifts were difficult to see clearly. They felt the consequences in rising costs, limited opportunities, and economic cycles that seemed increasingly detached from their daily realities. They experienced inflation as a personal burden, not understanding the global dynamics that contributed to it. They faced debt as an individual struggle, unaware of the structural incentives that encouraged widespread borrowing. The machine was everywhere in their lives, yet nowhere visible. And because the system operated on a global scale, no single government could alter it without risking economic upheaval. This silent coordination of influence created a world where prosperity and hardship were not determined solely by local conditions, but by the underlying logic of a structure designed long before modern citizens were born. Understanding this shift is essential because it reveals why economic decisions often feel predetermined, why policies repeat across nations, and why individual choices seem so small against the weight of the system. As you reflect on how these invisible forces have shaped your own financial experiences, share your thoughts in the comments about which parts of this influence feel most present in your life, and what patterns you see emerging behind the scenes. As the machine expanded across political systems and national borders, its most revealing feature became clear during periods of modern crisis. Unlike the shocks of earlier centuries, these crises unfolded in a world already interconnected by technology, global finance, and instantaneous information. This created a new dynamic. Every collapse, instead of destabilizing the system, reinforced its authority. The machine had become so deeply woven into global infrastructure that instability no longer threatened its existence. It strengthened it. The pattern emerged repeatedly. A banking crisis in one country triggered coordinated interventions from institutions that operated above national governments. Liquidity was injected, policies were aligned, and market panic was contained not through domestic decision-making, but through frameworks that reflected global financial priorities. When currencies fell, the solutions offered were not tailored to local needs. They followed the same structure: austerity, structural adjustment, tightened credit, external supervision. Each crisis became another moment when national autonomy weakened and systemic uniformity grew stronger. This process was not accidental. The machine thrived on predictability, and crises offered opportunities to rewrite the rules in ways that made future disruptions easier to manage. Regulations were updated, but always within the boundaries of global financial logic. Bailouts occurred, but the conditions attached ensured deeper integration into the system. Nations emerged from crises more dependent, not less. And because the machine positioned itself as the only stabilizing force capable of preventing total collapse, resistance seemed irresponsible, even dangerous. The public often misinterpreted these events as isolated failures, market mistakes, or unpredictable shocks. But behind the scenes, the same cycle repeated: crisis, intervention, consolidation. The machine was not merely reacting to instability, it was absorbing it, shaping the recovery process, and using each disruption to expand its influence into sectors that had previously resisted financial integration. Healthcare systems, educational institutions, public utilities, and even national pension funds became increasingly tied to global capital flows. This transformation altered the very meaning of economic risk. It was no longer distributed among independent institutions. It was centralized in a structure that determined which industries survived, which companies were rescued, and which nations received lifelines. And because the machine managed these decisions in real time, its influence became self-reinforcing. Every crisis justified its authority. Every recovery validated the framework. Every new dependency tightened the grip. For individuals living through these cycles, the experience often felt chaotic and unpredictable. But at a structural level, the machine was becoming more efficient, more coordinated, and more capable of shaping outcomes that aligned with its priorities. The result was a world where crises did not signal the weakening of the global financial structure, but its evolution into something even more deeply entrenched, preparing the ground for consequences that would soon become visible in the daily lives of ordinary people. As the machine tightened its hold through every modern crisis, its impact on ordinary people became impossible to ignore, even if few understood where that impact truly came from. For most individuals, the shifts in the global financial structure did not appear as abstract policies or institutional decisions. They appeared as rising prices at the grocery store, shrinking paychecks, unexpected fees, higher interest rates, and an overwhelming sense that no matter how hard they worked, the system always pushed them one step backward. This feeling was not accidental. It was the byproduct of an architecture designed to redirect value upward, quietly and consistently. Inflation became one of the system's most effective tools. While governments attributed price increases to temporary disruptions or global events, the deeper cause often traced back to cycles of debt expansion, currency manipulation, and monetary interventions shaped by the machine. Each new injection of liquidity, each adjustment in interest rates, each restructuring of financial markets subtly shifted purchasing power away from individuals and toward the institutions that managed the flow of money. People experienced this as a gradual erosion of their quality of life, a silent tax that required no legislation and sparked no public debate. At the same time, personal debt became a defining feature of modern existence. Mortgages, student loans, credit cards, medical bills. These were not isolated burdens, but structural mechanisms that kept individuals dependent on financial systems they had no role in shaping. As wages stagnated and costs rose, borrowing became a necessity rather than a choice, and the machine benefited at every stage. Interest payments fed the same institutions that influenced economic policy, while defaults and refinancing generated new revenue streams. People believed they were managing their finances, but in reality, they were navigating a system engineered to channel their income back into the structure that governed them. The loss of purchasing power further deepened this dependency. Savings held in traditional accounts failed to keep up with inflation, pushing individuals toward investments they barely understood, often at the urging of institutions that profited from the movement of capital. Retirement funds became tied to global markets, making the financial security of millions dependent on fluctuations far beyond their control. And as economic pressure increased, families extended work hours, delayed milestones, or abandoned aspirations entirely, all while believing their struggles were personal failures rather than structural outcomes. Even daily conveniences reflected this shift. Technologies that promised efficiency gradually evolved into gateways for extracting data, fees, and behavioral insights that fed the machine's predictive capabilities. The more interconnected life became, the easier it was for financial systems to anticipate needs, influence spending, and shape consumption patterns. Individuals felt overwhelmed by the pace of change, unaware that the pressure they felt was not random, but engineered through layers of economic incentives refined over generations. Through these subtle yet pervasive impacts, the machine reached its most intimate level of influence, shaping not only national economies, but personal realities. And as these shifts continued, the stage was set for the final revelation of how deeply this structure controls the wealth and direction of the world. By the time the machine reached this level of influence, its presence no longer depended on secrecy. It operated openly, woven into every financial decision, every policy debate, every economic forecast. Yet its power remained difficult for most people to define, because it did not announce itself as an institution or a single authority. Instead, it functioned like an operating system running beneath the global economy, quietly coordinating the movements of money, shaping the incentives of governments, and guiding the financial behavior of billions without ever revealing a face or a name. What makes this final stage so striking is how normal it feels. People navigate their daily lives believing they are making independent financial choices, but the boundaries of those choices were designed long before they were born. The interest rates that shape their debts, the inflation that erodes their savings, the job markets that determine their opportunities, the rising costs that redefine their expectations, none of these forces emerge naturally. They are the results of systems calibrated to maintain stability for the structure itself, not necessarily for the individuals living within it. And yet, despite its immense reach, the machine is not invincible. It depends on the belief that currencies hold value, that markets remain functional, that institutions maintain authority, and that the public continues to participate in a system they rarely fully understand. This reliance on collective confidence is both its strength and its vulnerability. History shows that every economic structure, no matter how sophisticated, eventually reaches a point where its internal pressures demand a transformation. Whether that transformation brings renewal or collapse depends on how much the public understands about the forces shaping their lives. This is why recognizing the pattern matters. Once you see how the machine was built, how it evolved, and how deeply it shapes your personal financial reality, the world looks different. You begin to understand why certain crises repeat, why policies across nations often move in the same direction, and why the gap between ordinary citizens and financial power continues to widen. And that awareness becomes a form of protection, a way to navigate a system that was never designed with individual prosperity as its primary goal. If you made it this far, it means this message resonated with you in a way most people never experience. So before you move on, leave a comment with the phrase, "I am seeing the pattern," because reaching the end of this story shows you are not just watching, you are understanding. And if the value of this journey connected with you, consider subscribing to keep exploring these hidden structures, and give a like so this conversation continues to grow naturally. There is another video right here that expands on these ideas in a way that completes this chapter of the story. Click and continue with me as we explore what comes next in this hidden architecture shaping your financial world.